This episode contains descriptions of gun violence, trauma, and school shootings. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Montreal, September 13th, 2006. It was a clear Wednesday afternoon. At Dawson College, a bustling downtown campus at the corner of Atwater and de Maisonneuve, students streamed between classes. Cafeterias were packed, others sat on the lawn, laughing and eating lunch. It should have been an ordinary school day, but at 12:30 p.m., everything changed. I'm Mark, and this is Northern Dark, true Canadian crime. The gunman was 25-year-old Kimveer Gill from Laval, Quebec. He was the son of Indian immigrant parents. By most accounts, his childhood was unremarkable. But as he grew older, he became more isolated. Gill had been bullied in high school, and by his mid-20s, he lived quietly at home with his mother. He had no steady job, few close friends, and spent much of his time immersed in dark corners of the internet. Online, Gill reinvented himself. On a gothic social networking site called vampirefreaks.com, he posted under the name Angel of Death. His profile tagline read, "Trenchcoat Mafia Reborn," a direct reference to the Columbine killers. He uploaded more than 50 photographs of himself, posing in a black trench coat, drinking from a bottle, glaring into the lens with sunglasses on. In others, he showed off his growing collection of firearms, cradling rifles, pointing pistols at the camera. His blog was even darker. In post after post, he raged against the world. Life sucks. Work sucks. School sucks. Humans are worthless. In another entry he wrote, "Anger and hatred will never die. It is inside all of us." And in perhaps the most chilling, he described his destiny: to die like a soldier in a blaze of gunfire. Gill's obsessions went beyond words. He idolized Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the Columbine shooters. He played a disturbing online game called Super Columbine Massacre RPG, where players reenact the massacre, gunning down students, then battling police. Investigators later confirmed he played it obsessively. In his mind, Dawson would be his stage, his chance to live out the violent fantasy he had been building online. What made Gill especially dangerous was that he was armed, legally. He owned 3 firearms, a Glock pistol, a Norinco shotgun, and a Beretta CX 4 Storm carbine. All 3 were registered. He had purchased the Beretta only weeks before the attack. And on September 13th, 2006, he packed them into his car, along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and drove toward downtown Montreal. It was just after 12:30 p.m. on Wednesday, September 13th, 2006. Kimveer Gill parked his black Pontiac Sunfire near Dawson College, across from the Alexis Nihon Mall. He stepped out of the car dressed head to toe in black, trench coat, combat boots, fingerless gloves. His hair was shaved into a mohawk. Slung over his shoulder was a Beretta CX-4 Storm semi-automatic carbine. In his bag, a Glock pistol, a shotgun, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Before entering the school, Gill confronted a passerby, a lawyer on his lunch break, and forced him at gunpoint to carry an extra bag of weapons. When the chaos broke out, the man dropped the bag and fled, escaping with his life. Gill raised his carbine and fired toward students sitting on the steps outside Dawson. 2 were hit instantly. Screams echoed as panicked classmates scattered. Gill then walked through the main doors and into the busy halls. Witnesses later described him as calm, almost casual. One student said, "He looked like he was enjoying it, smiling as he shot." At 12:35 p.m., Gill entered the cafeteria. More than 200 students were inside, crammed around tables, chatting over lunch. Gill placed his bag near the microwaves, pulled out his Beretta, and began shooting. Bullets tore into walls, shattered windows, and struck students at random. One eyewitness remembered, "We thought it was firecrackers. until we saw blood on the floor. Another survivor recalled crawling under a table as classmates around her screamed, "There was blood everywhere." He was shooting at anything that moved. Some students tried to run. Others froze, paralyzed by fear. A few pulled friends to safety, dragging them out through side doors. Gill moved methodically, ordering some to the floor while firing at others. His demeanor was chilling, calm, deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were playing out a role he'd rehearsed. In the middle of the cafeteria, 18-year-old Anastasia De Sousa was struck in the chest. She collapsed instantly. Nearby, another student was shot in the head. He would fall into a coma for weeks before finally waking in a hospital bed. Dozens more were wounded, legs, arms, backs, shoulders, as Gill kept firing. He would discharge at least 72 rounds in those few minutes. Under the tables, students pulled out their phones. Some dialed 911 in whispers. Others typed desperate messages to their families. "I love you. I don't know if I'll make it." Outside, police sirens screamed across downtown Montreal. Unlike the police at Columbine, who waited for backup, Montreal officers had been trained for rapid deployment. They didn't hold back. Within 3 minutes, the first officers entered Dawson. Constables Denny Cote and Alain Diallo charged toward the cafeteria. Gill turned his gun on them. Bullets flew across the room. One officer's shot struck Gill in the arm. Cornered, bleeding, and facing armed police, Gill raised his Glock pistol to his own head. At 12:48 p.m., he pulled the trigger. The attack was over. In less than 20 minutes, Gill had killed one young woman, injured 19 others, 6 critically, and left an entire college and city in shock. When the shooting ended, the human toll began to emerge. 18-year-old Anastasia De Sousa was killed. She was not even a Dawson student. She had come to campus that day to meet friends. Anastasia was described as outgoing, caring, and full of energy. She loved dancing, shopping, and being with her family. Friends said she lit up every room she walked into. Her death devastated her community, and for many, she became the face of the tragedy. But she was not the only victim. 19 others were wounded, 6 of them critically. One student was shot in the head and rushed to hospital in a coma. He would spend weeks on a ventilator before finally regaining consciousness, beginning a long, uncertain journey of rehabilitation. Others were shot in the arms, legs, and backs. Some underwent multiple surgeries. Many would live with permanent scars and lasting pain. Inside the cafeteria, the moments after the gunfire stopped were a blur of confusion and horror. Survivors described crawling across the floor through blood, pulling wounded classmates to safety. Some ripped off jackets or scarves to press against bullet wounds. Others tried to whisper words of comfort to friends who had been hit, unsure if help would arrive in time. One student later recalled, "I saw him raise his gun and shoot a girl. She fell right away. That image will never leave me." Another survivor said, "There was blood everywhere. People were screaming and pushing to get out. I thought I was going to die." Others hid under tables, clutching their phones. Some dialed 911 in whispers. Others sent desperate text messages. "I love you. I don't know if I'll make it." Outside, students poured into the streets in shock. Many collapsed on the sidewalk, bleeding, waiting for help. Paramedics set up triage zones right onto Maisonneuve Boulevard, laying stretchers directly on the pavement. But long after the bleeding was stopped, the deeper wounds remained. In the months following Dawson, researchers found that nearly 30% of students and staff developed a mental health disorder, post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, or substance dependence. That's almost twice the average rate in Quebec. For nearly 1 in 5, it was their first ever mental illness. And yet most never sought help. A follow-up study revealed only 13% received professional support. Many believed their problems would go away on their own. For some, they never did. At the 15-year anniversary in 2021, survivors described how the trauma still lingers. Megan Hennigan, who had been shot twice in the leg, explained, "The physical pain has dulled, but the emotional pain, that never goes away. Loud noises, crowded spaces, even certain smells still trigger flashbacks. Others said the memories haunt their dreams, returning as nightmares that never fade." For the parents of Anastasia De Sousa, every September is a reminder of what was stolen. At Dawson's Peace Garden, built in her memory, they return year after year. Her father once said, "We come here to remember her, and to wonder what she would have been doing today." The tragedy was not confined to the day of the shooting. For survivors, it became a lifelong journey of healing, grief, and endurance. When the gunfire stopped at Dawson, the crisis was far from over. The cafeteria was a war zone. Broken glass, overturned tables, pools of blood. Students ran for the exits, stumbling over chairs and each other. Some froze in shock, unwilling to move until police shouted them out. Outside, de Maisonneuve Boulevard filled with chaos. Students spilled onto the streets, some sobbing, others bleeding, many still clutching their cell phones. Paramedics rushed in, setting up triage zones right on the sidewalks. Victims were laid out on stretchers and blankets. The most critical were rushed into ambulances, sirens screaming toward Montreal General Hospital just 5 minutes away. Doctors later said the first patient arrived in under 10 minutes. Trauma teams were waiting. In the hours that followed, hospitals across the city filled with the wounded and with terrified families desperate for news. Parents packed the waiting rooms, some not knowing until late that night whether their children were alive. On campus, survivors who had escaped were herded into nearby Concordia University. Classrooms and student lounges became makeshift shelters. Counselors and crisis teams arrived, trying to calm hundreds of students in shock. For days, Dawson remained closed. Police combed the campus for evidence. The blood-stained cafeteria was sealed as a crime scene. That night, vigils began. Hundreds gathered outside Dawson, candles in hand, flowers at their feet. Strangers hugged each other, whispering prayers, wiping tears. The city was stunned. Montreal had lived through tragedy before, the École Polytechnique massacre in 1989. But Dawson reopened old wounds. Politicians quickly weighed in. From New York, where he was attending the United Nations, Prime Minister Stephen Harper said, "Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims and their families. We wish a speedy recovery to those who were injured in this senseless act of violence." Quebec Premier Jean Charest called it a day of terrible tragedy. All Quebecers are in shock. We mourn together. Montreal's Mayor Gérald Tremblay urged solidarity. This tragedy touches every Montrealer, every family, every parent. We must stand united. Across Quebec, flags were lowered to half-mast. The city of Montreal was in mourning. But even as the candles flickered, a debate was already forming about guns, mental health, and what could have been done to prevent Dawson. In the days that followed, the grief gave way to questions. How did a 25-year-old man with a history of violent online posts legally own 3 firearms? Why had no one intervened when he was writing openly about wanting to die in a blaze of gunfire? Kim Veer-Gill's Beretta, CX-4 Storm carbine, sleek, compact, semi-automatic, quickly became a lightning rod. He had purchased it legally just weeks before the shooting. Survivors and advocates demanded to know why such a weapon was accessible at all. Prime Minister Stephen Harper praised the police for their quick action, but sidestepped the larger gun debate. Critics accused his government of dragging its feet on firearms control, particularly the long gun registry, which was already under fire politically. Survivors didn't stay silent. Megan Hennigan, who had been shot twice in the leg, emerged as a leading voice. On the first anniversary, she launched a national campaign for stronger gun laws, telling reporters, "I'm not going to let what happened to me happen to someone else. We shouldn't wait for the next tragedy before we act." But gun control wasn't the only debate Dawson ignited. Days after the shooting, the Globe and Mail published a column by journalist Jan Wong, who suggested Quebec's language laws, Bill 101, had fostered alienation, and that this cultural exclusion had contributed to school shootings like Polytechnique, Concordia, and Dawson. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Quebec Premier Jean Charest called it a disgrace. The House of Commons unanimously condemned the article. Even survivors said it was a painful distraction from mourning. For many, the debate showed how quickly tragedy can become politicized, how shock turns into arguments about culture, politics, and blame. But behind the debates, the deeper wounds remained, carried not in Parliament, but in the hospital wards of Montreal and the classrooms of Dawson College. In the years after Dawson, the campus tried to heal. In 2011, the college inaugurated the Peace Garden, a living memorial to Anastasia De Sousa. Planted with flowers, trees, and benches, it became a place for reflection and remembrance. Each September, students, staff, and Anastasia's family gather there to honor her life. Her parents often speak of wondering what she would be doing today if she had lived. But healing did not come easily. A study in the years after the shooting found that nearly 30% of Dawson's community developed a mental health disorder, PTSD, depression, anxiety, or alcohol dependence, almost double the average rate in Quebec. For many, the trauma still lingers. At the 15-year anniversary, survivor Megan Hennigan explained, "The physical pain has dulled, but the emotional pain, that never goes away." Others described nightmares, flashbacks, and fear triggered by loud noises or crowded spaces. Some turned pain into action. Hennigan launched a national gun control campaign, pushing for stricter laws on semi-automatic firearms and warning politicians not to wait for the next tragedy. For Dawson itself, the tragedy reshaped policy. Montreal's trauma centers rewrote their Code Orange emergency plans, making Dawson a case study for how to respond to mass casualty events. Police credited their rapid deployment training with preventing dozens more deaths. And yet, despite these changes, survivors say little has truly shifted. Semi-automatic rifles remain legal in Canada. Mental health gaps persist. The same warning signs that Gill posted online are often ignored in others. Dawson also occupies a complex place in Canada's memory. The Polytechnique massacre in 1989 remains the nation's darkest school shooting. Dawson, 17 years later, is sometimes overshadowed. But for those who were there, the pain is no less real. One survivor said, "This anniversary isn't just about the past. It's about making sure it never happens again." The scars of Dawson run deep, in the bodies of the wounded, in the silence of classrooms, in the hearts of families who never got to say goodbye. It was one day in September 2006, but for survivors, it has lasted a lifetime. School shootings in Canada are rare, but when they do happen, they leave scars that last for decades. Dawson College joins the list, alongside Polytechnique in 1989, Tabor in 1999, and Brampton Centennial in 1975. Each tragedy is different, but each one leaves the same questions behind. How do we recognize warning signs before it's too late? How do we keep schools safe in a country that prides itself on peace? And how do we honor those who were lost, not just with memorials, but with action? For the students of Dawson, for the families, and for Anastasia De Sousa, the wounds remain. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us to another episode of Northern Dark. I'm Mark, and as always, I'm here with Leah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. I wanted to say thank you to everyone that has shared, liked, and subscribed to our podcast. We have over 20,000 views on YouTube alone, and we are at 65 followers on YouTube.
This podcast is a personal passion, and we are glad you are on this journey with us. And as we research each episode, we are often left with shaking our heads and wondering how a disturbed man like Kimveer Gill could just go unnoticed, or how anybody that read his posts didn't just report them to the police.
Right, because if the police knew, maybe they would have seized his guns. Maybe it would have scared him. It's all speculation at this point, but I feel that we need to do better as a society when we see people in distress or posting hateful rhetoric to harm others.
Absolutely. And for Montreal, the shooting at Dawson College wasn't just a standalone tragedy. It reopened old wounds from 1989, the École Polytechnique massacre. Marc Lépine stormed into a classroom, separated the men from the women, and murdered 14 young women because of their gender. That was pure misogynistic rage, but the shooting at Dawson College was different. Gill's violence came from obsession with Columbine, fantasy, and nihilism. But for the city, it felt like history repeating itself. Another campus, another shooter, another generation scarred.
And I think what ties them together is how survivors responded. After Polytechnique, women like Heidi Rathjen and other survivors fought tirelessly for stronger gun laws. And after Dawson, survivors like Megan Hennigan carried that work forward. She had been shot twice in the leg, but on the first anniversary, she launched a cross-Canada campaign calling for stricter controls on semi-automatics. Both groups of survivors tried to turn grief into advocacy.
And yet, Canada's still here. Semi-automatic carbines like Gill's Beretta, CX-4 Storm are still legal. Politicians still argue about registries instead of acting. The question becomes, did we really learn anything from Polytechnique and Dawson? Or are we doomed to keep circling back to the same debates after each tragedy?
And it's not just in Canada. Look at what happened recently in the U.S. with Charlie Kirk, a political figure shot and killed while speaking on a university campus. Different context, but the same pattern.
Right. And the connection is online culture. Gill left behind a toxic blog and hundreds of photos calling himself the Angel of Death, just as Mark Lepine left behind a manifesto. Now we see shooters feeding off memes, forums, conspiracy groups. In Kirk's case, violent rhetoric online escalated into real violence. The details are still unfolding, but it's another warning that what brews online doesn't always stay online.
And the internet doesn't just incubate the anger, it broadcasts the violence. Videos of Kirk's shooting spread instantly across social platforms. Just like Dawson, where Gill's Vampire Freaks page became a media spectacle, online spaces keep amplifying killers long after the shots stop.
That's why the mass shooting at Dawson College still matters. It's not just history, it's a blueprint. The signs were there, violent blogs, fantasies about Columbine, guns purchased legally, all ignored. Polytechnique showed us misogyny armed with a rifle. Dawson showed us the internet could turn fantasy into bloodshed. Kirk's case shows it's still happening.
And that's the chilling through line. The warning signs are always visible, but only if we take them seriously.
Exactly. For our listeners, these are not just cases. They're lessons for change. The question is whether we'll listen.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you see connections between Dawson, Polytechnique, and modern cases like Charlie Kirk's? Join the conversation with us on YouTube or X. Leave a comment, share your perspective, or tell us how these stories resonate with you. You can also join our online community on YouTube. Look for our YouTube short and comment on our pinned post. We'd love to hear from you.
Definitely. We will be back next Monday with a new episode. Until then, take care of each other.